Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. This is the second colloquium on race, equity, and social justice in this academic year. And I'm Bonnie Thornton Dill, Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities and professor in the Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. This series, which launched last year in 2020, is part of ARHU's broader initiative on race, equity, and social justice.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Okay, something started speaking to me. All right, Siri started speaking to me. I don't know who's doesn't. Anyway, I'll keep talking and see what happens. Anyway, it's part of the series on race, equity, and social justice, and which was developed around the goal of understanding and dismantling structural racism. The broader initiative includes transforming curriculum, reducing discrimination in teaching, research, and service, and expanding the impact of ARHU's long-standing and continuing scholarship on racism, anti-racism, equity, and justice. Also, consistent with President Pine's focus on racial justice and identity, we are pleased to welcome students participating with us as part of the Terrapin Strong onboarding program. In ARHU, part of our approach is to offer opportunities for our students to be exposed to the many different ways faculty in the college study and teach about these issues. So beginning last year, I invited faculty experts from across ARHU to discuss their scholarship and creative projects related to anti-racism and social justice. Last year, we focused on anti-Black racism. This year, we continue these conversations, expanding the lens to look at impacts of systemic racism on different social groups, Asian, Jewish, Arab, and Muslim populations in the US, LGBTQ, and Black people in the US as well. So the format for each session includes a brief presentation by our expert scholar, which will be followed by a conversation with me, and then an opportunity. We'll open it up for an opportunity for those of you in the audience to ask questions. We ask that you put your microphones on mute and keep them on mute, and hopefully Siri won't talk to you like she talked to me for some reason. During the last 15 minutes, you'll be invited to submit questions through the chat, which will be moderated by Associate Dean Patrick Warfield, who will manage the question and answers. Please note that this event is being recorded for future viewing on ARHU's website. So today's session features Dr. Janelle Wong, who's professor in the Department of American Studies and Government and Politics, and a core faculty member in the Asian American Studies program. Dr. Wong's research focuses on race, ethnicity, and politics. She uses mixed methods and specializes in multi-ethnic, multilingual surveys of Asian Americans and other groups. Wong is the author of Immigrants, Evangelicals, and Politics in an Era of Demographic Change and Democracy's Promise, Immigrants and American Civic Institutions from 2014 to 2017. Wong served on the National Board of the Association of Asian American Studies. I think that's from 2014 to 2017. Wong served on the National Board of the Association for Asian American Studies. Her advocacy work has focused on support for affirmative action and other Asian American issues. Her opinion writing has been featured in national and local news media. She has co-authored amicus briefs in support of affirmative action and voting rights. So the title of her remarks today is At the Crossroads, Black and Asian American Relations in US Politics Today. She will examine issues of immigration, affirmative action, and hate crimes to better understand opportunities for cross-racial solidarity among Black and Asian American communities. Her research draws on public opinion surveys and government documents to illustrate surprising findings about the potential and challenges for interracial coalitions in this current moment. So I'm really excited to have you here today, Professor Wong. I think it's very timely. It's very timely in terms of what's happening in the world and also in terms of what's happening around this campus. And so everyone, please join me in welcoming Professor Janelle Wong.
Thank you so much, Dean Thornton Dill. I am excited to have this conversation with you. And I also want to thank Patrick Warfield and Ashley Richardson Miller for the organizing of this series. I also want to thank all of you who are joining us today. Thank you for being here on a Friday morning. And I'll just go ahead and start this presentation. So there's the rise in anti-Asian sentiment and reported anti-Asian incidents over the past year have really lifted up for Asian American communities this wide net of anti-Asian racism that is now at the forefront of many Asian Americans' minds. And this began to really start to occupy our community when the pandemic started and President Trump blamed coronavirus, the spread of coronavirus, on China and used terms like the Kung flu and the China virus. And we started to see a rise in anti-Asian bias. Then a year later, almost a year later, in March of 2021, this moment came where there was a mass shooting that included 6 Asian American women in Atlanta, followed just a month later by another mass shooting that killed 4 Sikh Americans in Indianapolis. And this began to raise the salience of racism for Asian Americans in wide parts of the community. But this also began to create a response that I think illustrates the complex and relational nature of race and racial formation in the US. And so almost immediately, we began to see Republicans, for instance, leveraging, almost weaponizing attention to anti-Asian hate to take aim at longstanding programs to create racial equity like affirmative action. We also saw some tensions over whether or not the attention to anti-Asian racism was coming against the backdrop of lack of attention to police violence and addressing police violence. So my colleague Claire Kim, for instance, wrote a pretty incisive op-ed that charges that the way in which anti-Asian racism was addressed immediately in Congress through a federal hate crimes act was really in stark contrast to the lack of momentum around the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. And when we think about this past year, it was clear that Asian Americans had really taken a strong stand in some ways against police brutality and anti-Black racism. So we saw a lot of activism among especially younger Asian Americans, but across the Asian American community with regard to Black Lives Matter. At the same time, there is these photos that were symbolic, I think, and a role that was symbolic. When Derek Chauvin's trial took place, it also became clear that an Asian American police officer was a bystander during the killing of George Floyd, and that became a potent symbol in our communities, this role that the Asian American police officer held in terms of potential complicity among Asian Americans with regard to anti-Black racism. And so I want to highlight the ways in which research and particularly the survey data that I've been collecting can shed light on these relations and on the tensions and possibilities of coalition building in our communities. And so I'm going to share some data that I collected with my colleagues just 2 days after the March attacks in Atlanta and the killing of 6 Asian American women. This survey included more than 16,000 adults and more than 2,000 Asian Americans. And I think it helps us to understand the current moment. So survey research like this can really uncover racialized experiences. And 2 of the key experiences for Asian Americans have to do with longstanding stereotypes. One is the forever foreigner stereotype, which is deeply rooted in history, shaped by white supremacist notions of who belongs in the United States, but also came to the forefront of American life as Asian people were blamed for the spread of coronavirus. But there's also another stereotype that has been quite tenacious in our communities, and that is the idea that Asian Americans are model minorities who have made it despite their non-white status. So I want to just share some of the key findings from this survey. And we can see the racialization and different forms of racialization across these survey questions. So this really plays into the forever foreigner stereotype. When people were asked, have you ever been encouraged to Americanize or whiten your name? You can see that Pacific Islanders and Asian Americans are the most likely to report this kind of microaggression. Have people asked you where you are from, assuming you're not from the United States? This is like the signature experience of racialization, and assumptions of not being from the United States have long been with us and are part of the forever foreigner stereotype. And you can see that it is really Asian Americans, but also other groups that experience this form of exclusion. People have acted as if you don't speak English. And this is something that is common for both Asian Americans and for Latinx, as well as other groups. But then we also see that these survey data can capture other kinds of racializations as well. So people have acted as if you are dishonest. Here we see that Black Americans face this kind of microaggression more than other groups. Asian Americans are among the least likely to experience this kind of assumption, and that is because of the model minority stereotype. This is, I think, was a surprising finding to us because this was over the pandemic year where there were a lot of assumptions that people would be feeling fears about being in contact with Asian Americans. Again, we see Black Americans more likely to suffer from this kind of microaggression, Asian Americans on the lower level here. And this again has to do with longstanding stereotypes of Black criminality and the model minority stereotype working in tandem. Now, these data also help us to understand the very differential racializations and experiences that different groups have with discrimination. So against this kind of backdrop of anti-Asian racism, a rise in anti-Asian sentiment, this was also a time where the US was having a very, and hopefully continues to have, a very important discussion about police misconduct and police killings. And so you can see here in our data that this is captured, that Black Americans are the most likely to have experienced police misconduct. Asian Americans are among the least likely to report this kind of discrimination. And when it comes to other kinds of institutional racism, such as housing discrimination, we can again see that Black Americans are much more likely to report this kind of discrimination compared to Asian Americans. And this is among the most poignant kinds of questions we ask, which is, have you ever been unfairly discouraged by a teacher? Again, a kind of institutionalized racism from continuing your education. And you can see that a group that is closely associated with Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, are likely to experience this kind of racism, but Asian Americans are the least likely to report this kind of discrimination. And again, that is because of this tenacious power of the model minority stereotype and the assumption that Asian Americans, regardless of their levels of poverty, regardless of where they're living, sometimes are assumed to be quote unquote good students. We also asked about hate crimes because this was the primary kind of topic in the news, and we defined it like this: have you ever had someone verbally or physically abuse you or damage your property specifically because of your race or ethnicity? And this, I'm going to move here. Okay, sorry. This is actually a really interesting question. What we found is that hate crimes against Asian Americans had increased over the pandemic year, but hate crimes over the lifetime were much more likely to be reported by Black Americans and other groups. And so we saw kind of convergence in the levels of hate crimes experienced by Asian Americans and other groups of color over the pandemic year. But when people were asked about, have you ever experienced a hate crime, it was really Black Americans who had experienced the highest levels. This is not a surprise. This is what hate crime data have shown for a very long time. So this, I think, is an important point, which is that over this year, as we saw an increase in anti-Asian violence in California, Black residents reported actually 5 times the number of hate crimes as Asian California residents, even though they were less than half of the population size of Asian Americans. And so even during this year where Asian Americans have become more and more aware in the rest of the country of anti-Asian hate, this was actually a relational issue where we saw that other groups too were experiencing very high levels of racialized violence. And the coverage of this topic did give me some pause. So while in California, Black Americans were the most impacted by racialized violence, some of the headlines look like this: treating hate crimes as solely an Asian American issue, when the long history of racism in the United States shows us that that is definitely not the case. So research can really, I think, expand this conversation, because data can show that racialized violence is not isolated to a single community. Incidents that are captured by, for instance, the hashtag #StopAAPIHate are really part of a much broader problem of hate violence experienced across communities of color. So communities of color are all affected by white supremacy, but the form racism takes varies across groups in ways that I think are really dangerous to flatten. So here we can just see that it's not just a matter of reporting. All groups are reluctant to report a hate crime. And you can see that Black and Asian Americans are both very hesitant in terms of their feelings that justice will be served if they report a hate crime. So there is a lack of confidence in the justice system. I want to turn to policies here: Black Lives Matter, affirmative action, and immigration, as a way to zero in on Black and Asian American relations in US politics today. So here what we see is that against this kind of attention to Asian Americans' experiences with racism, there are also these kind of conservative forces that are operating. And for instance, prior to the pandemic, Asian Americans were taking a greater role, especially Chinese Americans, in challenging key civil rights and equity provisions like affirmative action. And again, some research that I have done, particularly in language surveys of Asian Americans, can shed light on some of these dynamics. So I think it's important to note that even though Asian Americans have been the face of anti-affirmative action movements over the past 5 years, the majority of Asian Americans have demonstrated in some ways remarkably consistent support for affirmative action over the past 7 years. So what we can see is that registered voters in election after election have demonstrated support for race-conscious admissions. Now, these survey data also show where there are vulnerabilities in that support. And it really has to do with my own group, Chinese Americans, where you can see much more fluctuation. And I can talk about that more in the Q&A. But I think the bottom line here is that the media, prior to the pandemic, 80% of the media coverage of Asian Americans was on affirmative action. But they never covered these particular data points. Instead, it all focused on kind of headlines like this. But in fact, the community looks more like this. And I will also say that Chinese Americans today are 25% of the broader Asian American population. So they are not the majority of the population either. I want to just share some other data from my most recent survey. This survey was released just a couple of months ago, and it includes actually more than 20,000 respondents. This particular subsample is a sample of Latinx, Black, Asian Americans, and non-Hispanic whites, and you can see we have large numbers of respondents here. But the survey also includes 300 to 1,000, more than 1,000 of these groups: Afro-Caribbeans, Black immigrants, LGBTQ people, Muslim Americans, Native Americans, and Native Hawaiians. So this is a really exciting new project, and it also helps us to understand race in America. And I just want to draw your attention to thinking about Asian Americans and some of these issues that have come out of Black Lives Matter or relate directly to Black Lives Matter. And here you can see that support for reforms to stop the killing and abuse of African Americans, you can see the breakdown here across these racial groups. And Asian Americans and Latinx are more likely to support these kinds of reforms than white Americans. But you can also see there's a similar gap between those two groups and Black Americans when it comes to support for these reforms. In terms of attending a Black Lives Matter protest, here we see that again, Asian Americans and Latinx are more likely than their white counterparts to have attended a protest. And remember, this is over the pandemic year. So the protests were slightly down over that time, but still less likely than their Black American counterparts to take part in a protest. Well, the last issue that I wanted to attend to is immigration. And this is a project that I just completed. And I wanted to just share this overall demographic context and then get into the findings. So we know that about 75% of Asian adults in the US are immigrants. And that compares to about 10% of Black adults in the US. And Asian Americans are actually the fastest growing group of undocumented immigrants. Even though they're not the largest group, they are the fastest growing group of undocumented immigrants today, which can also, tell us something about how the media covers undocumented immigrants and why, and creates, I think, a question about why the border wall receives so much attention when most of the Asian American immigrants who are residing in the US are coming in through visa overstays. But nonetheless, this is, I think, a really important issue, the growth of undocumented immigrants in the Asian American community. And in our community in Maryland, there has also been, as this community has grown, a mobilization of conservative reactions to efforts to protect undocumented immigrants in the state of Maryland. So I think this was in 2017 that Maryland, the state legislature attempted to pass a statewide law to provide sanctuary to undocumented immigrants. That is to prohibit the cooperation between local law enforcement and federal immigration authorities when it came to undocumented immigrants. And one of the headlines of this in that moment was that Chinese immigrants were among the most visible opponents of those sanctuary laws. And in fact, their efforts were successful. That law did not move forward, in large part because of these protests. And I say this all because immigration is an issue where many people think that Asian Americans will be progressive on this issue, and they are for the most part, but it is also complicated. And so the study I did, I have a study that is called "Why Are Black Americans More Progressive on Immigration Than Asian Americans?" And one of the things that is really striking about the results of this is that Black Americans actually express more competition with immigrants than Asian Americans. So when asked, do you think immigrants pose job competition to your community? Black Americans are more likely to say yes. They are more likely also to say that they have less linked fate than Asian Americans with immigrants. But despite the fact that they express more competition with immigrant communities, less linked fate with immigrant communities, we see that Black Americans are actually more progressive than the already very progressive Asian Americans on the issue of immigration. So here we see that Black Americans in 2 different surveys are more likely to agree with a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants compared to Asian Americans. So let me say that a little bit more clearly. Black Americans are more likely than Asian Americans to support a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. And this is not only true for policies related to undocumented immigrants, it is also true with policies that affect legal immigrants. And this was really surprising to me because Asian Americans over the past 50 years have been the primary beneficiaries of policies to increase legal immigration. But still we see that Black Americans are more likely than Asian Americans to support increasing numbers of work visas and family visas, despite the fact that they have many fewer immigrants in their communities. So I'll just end with these kinds of reflections that we can use these data to understand some of the overarching dynamics that are shaping Black and Asian relations today in US politics. On the one hand, we see that there are efforts to confront white supremacy among both Black and Asian communities, sometimes together. And there is a long history, especially of Black support for Asian American rights. So when the Chinese exclusion was in effect, Frederick Douglass, our own Marylander, was one of the most public figures to challenge Chinese exclusion. And you can also see that kind of allyship and solidarity continues to this day. So the photo on the right is right after the start of the pandemic. It was really this institutionalized response that the Congressional Black Caucus and the Latino caucus, the Hispanic caucus played. They immediately condemned anti-Asian racism before almost any other elected officials had been condemning the potential for anti-Asian racism at the start of the pandemic. And we also see the same thing to some extent among Asian Americans. So there have been efforts within Asian American communities to be explicit about the fact that more policing could actually, to combat anti-Asian hate crimes, could actually undermine a part of the Black Lives Matter agenda. So I will leave you with these kinds of reflections on solidarity. We are at, I think, a moment of, and I do think it is a crossroads where there could be a potential for more solidarity, but there are also serious vulnerabilities in the potential for solidarity as well. And I look forward to your questions and the larger conversation.
Janelle, thank you very much. Really interesting. Lots of things to unpack. I want to start at a very kind of abstract level a little bit before we kind of delve into the data, because I think this whole question about solidarity and who benefits from solidarity and who benefits by keeping divisiveness at play is an interesting and important one. But as someone who is a professor of American Studies, a professor of government and politics, a researcher who does work that is both quantitative and qualitative, a humanist and a social scientist, I'm just interested in kind of how you bring all of these things together and how you feel the data and the research and the information that you collect informs humanistic inquiry.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so it has been so enriching for me to be in ARHU and to be in conversation with humanists. And while much of my work is quantitative, I will say that, you know, one of the things that we really emphasize in American Studies is understanding people's everyday lives and the everyday experiences that shape how we understand US society. And many people think about survey data as sort of this abstract, quantitative set of knowledge. But in fact, what survey data do is they capture, in a way that almost no other kind of data collection can do, many, many everyday voices. And so these are not elite interviews. These are not interviews just with people making decisions, but survey data reach out and give voice and help us to understand what people on the ground, your average person who will pick up the phone or take a survey, I will give you that. But what your average person, your typical person is thinking about these really complex issues. And so I do think that survey data provide a glimpse, and an important glimpse, into everyday Americans' beliefs. And these beliefs can be, you know, very different from elites and decision makers.
Thank you. Thank you. You said something about, we were talking in the support for affirmative action. And as you showed that data and showed how Asian Americans as a group had been pretty supportive over time, Chinese had been less so. I think it would be helpful if you talked a little bit about the complexity of who all is in this category called Asian American, and how some of those differences in terms of experience, background, history, all of that kind of culture, language, all of that may impact some of these differences. And then what do we do about it?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I feel like has been, like, diversity is the hallmark of the Asian American community. And that is actually true for most groups. So Asian Americans, it's just very stark when you look at the Asian American community that there are national origin differences, there are differences in immigrant generation and nativity, citizenship differences, language, religion, foodways. And so these differences, sometimes I teach the I emphasize the diversity of Asian Americans really as a window to understanding that all groups, you can actually kind of do the same analysis with all groups, but it's just a little bit more dramatic in the Asian American community. And on the one hand, we see that there are national origin differences, are really differences in, to some extent, resources because of our immigration laws. And so the vast majority of Asian American immigrants have come since the 1990s, many as the result of changes in immigration law that emphasize the recruitment of highly educated immigrants from especially China and India. And so those who are recruited through what's called the H-1B visa program, or or who come to the United States as international students, have high levels of education, and their resources reflect that. So that tends to be East Asian groups, including Chinese and Indians. And we can see this, right? Because, for instance, over 50% of Chinese in the US have a bachelor's degree. And among Americans more generally, that rate is closer to 40%. And in China, about 8% of people have a bachelor's degree. So sometimes people say, oh, Asian values account for high levels of education, but it's really our immigration laws, right? And because Asian values, are they more prevalent in China or in the United States? So, so that's one stream of immigration, and it maps onto national origin. But there are other groups in the under the Asian American umbrella that include Southeast Asian groups and some South Asian groups who primarily have come to the United States via refugee status and then sponsored family members after that. And so we see that all those groups also have Asian American values. They don't have the same levels of educational attainment, or they face higher barriers to obtaining socioeconomic resources. And so within the community, there's huge polarization, and that affects our politics to some extent. However, I have another paper that actually emphasizes that despite this diversity, the kind of political, we can still identify, I would say, a moderate political agenda. And so Asian Americans as a whole, despite their language, national origin, diversity, are more likely as a whole to support like a big government with more services, or taxing the rich, or environmental, they're strong environmentalists on these issues like the environment, universal healthcare. Despite their diversity, Asian Americans actually look quite a lot more progressive than Americans more generally.
Excuse me. I think it's interesting that you don't hear that. And I wonder why that is, and why, I mean, you pointed to the focus on anti-affirmative action, but I wonder if you would say a little bit more about that and why some of these things are kind of hidden.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to do with two factors. One is stereotypes. So most people, when they think about Asian Americans, they think they will be like all in on immigration policy because of the forever foreigner stereotype. And actually, there's a lot of variation among Asian Americans when it comes to immigration policy. The data I show that Asian Americans as a whole are supportive of, for instance, a path to citizenship, but they're not more supportive than Americans more generally. Americans more generally all support, I mean, not all, but that's totally wrong. But a majority of Americans support a path to citizenship, and Asian Americans align exactly with the kind of support, that level of support. It's really Black Americans and Latinx who show stronger support. But the forever foreigner stereotype leads people to think immigration is going to be Asian Americans' issue. The model minority stereotype makes them assume that education will be their issue. And so that's why there is so much attention to their opposition of really a small segment of the community to affirmative action and race conscious admissions. But this is also a function of white supremacy and the use of this narrative, like an Asian American penalty narrative, by people who outside the Asian American community who oppose affirmative action and really oppose the acknowledgement of racism in any aspect of US life. It is, I think, though, a moment that where Asian Americans need to reflect on the fact that while other groups have stood have aligned with them and have really shown solidarity from an institutional perspective to protect the rights of Asian Americans. Opposing affirmative action is also an institutional response and is the exact opposite kind of, the exact opposite of solidarity. And it is institutional racism, in my view, to attack affirmative action.
I think I probably need to make this my last question and really open it up. But I don't want to end without asking you to comment a little bit on because it relates to the model minority myth. And that is the furor, or the maybe supposed furor. Certainly the Diamondback had an article about it, about the ways in which Asian Americans get counted or not counted around the whole issue of underrepresented minorities. It seems to me in some ways that our notion of underrepresented minorities is tied to, it's tied to the 1965 Civil Rights Act. It's tied to a period when the racial makeup of the United States looked different than it does today. And so I was just struck by the linking of those things together. And I just would like to ask you to comment on that before I open.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And this is something that I think the news coverage over the last week has given many of us an opportunity to consider more deeply. And my answer is a long one. I'll try to make it short so we have some opportunities to talk more. But I think that it is clear that Asian Americans are non-white, and that including them without differentiation with whites can play into the model minority stereotype, in that it assumes that those experiences are similar. At the same time, Asian Americans are not always underrepresented minorities. And so when it comes to race-conscious programs, especially with regard to admissions, then I think Asian Americans as a whole are actually overrepresented, not underrepresented. Yet there are, as I have mentioned, segments in our community, and that's about 20% of Asian Americans, who are underrepresented. And that's why this issue is complicated. So as an aggregate group, maybe, and not, I would say certainly, Asian Americans as an aggregate group should not be targeted with programs to recruit and admit underrepresented groups, but certain segments of our community that are underrepresented, Cambodians, Vietnamese, Hmong, Lao people, Nepalese to some extent, the list is long. But again, this group makes up, a substantial, but not the majority of the population, 20%. Those groups are underrepresented minorities, and they are Asian American. Okay, so that's at the admissions level. When Asian Americans come to campus, they do suffer from implicit bias and from discrimination. And there are lots of data that show that Asian Americans on campuses, for instance, report lower levels of feelings of belonging, report experiences with microaggressions and discrimination, and even anti-Asian violence on campus. In that context, then, Asian Americans should be considered with other students of color as needing additional support when it comes to programs to help them navigate racism on campus. That might be something like a staff support dedicated to Asian American issues on campus and to mental health services. And so it's a very complex kind of question, but I guess the bottom line is that Asian Americans are non-white. They do experience discrimination when it comes to admissions. some Asian American groups are underrepresented, but some are overrepresented. And that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be admitted to campus, but we need to recognize they shouldn't be treated as underrepresented minorities there. When students come to campus, they are facing, Asian American students do face racial discrimination, and we need to acknowledge that and address that. At the same time, we cannot take our eye off the pressing needs of underrepresented groups on our campus that don't always include Asian Americans. So that's my answer.
Okay. Well, that's helpful. Thank you for helping us think about that. Patrick, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for all of that, Professor Wong. That was really some fascinating information. I want to invite all of our guests to please drop questions in the chat. You can send them directly to me if you'd like, or raise your hand. And I actually see that Professor Coles from the Department of English has a hand raised. You want to unmute and ask your question?
Good morning. Thank you for that. It's a wonderful talk. I have been recently, J. Caspian Kang recently wrote in the New York Times about voting patterns among Asian Americans. And he did sort of thoughtfully parse the Asian American community and then proceeded to treat them as a voting bloc. But did talked quite a lot about opposition to affirmative action and trends like opposition to eliminating the entry examination for the Lowell School in San Francisco, or the momentum behind Youngkin. He related it to the Thomas Jefferson High School changing admissions requirements and eliminating the exam. He writes that many may even see America's egalitarianism as anathema both to their American dream and the pathways to success for their children. I hasten to say I find him suspect in all sorts of ways, but I was wondering what your response to that would be.
Thank you so much, Kim. Yeah, this is an area that I've worked on quite a bit with both in community organizations, but also with colleagues on campus, Racina Samora Liu, and also William Liu and Richard Shin. We're analyzing some of these, some of the rhetoric around these cases, especially the K through 12 level. And I think what J. Caspian Kang is identifying is a real movement in the Asian American community, which is real opposition to race-conscious programs and a kind of hoarding of opportunity that is dangerous and that doesn't represent, though, the majority of the community. So I think what is happening is, those movements have been extremely successful, even though they are predominantly, they're not Pan-Asian, they are predominantly Chinese, and to some extent, some Indian Americans who are actually the most progressive on race in our community. But they have been powerful for over 5 years. They have been funded to some extent by right-wing groups, and they have captured, so even when these court cases that involve Asian Americans and educational equity are unsuccessful, like the Harvard case, it's still moving forward, but a judge said there is no evidence of anti-Asian intentional discrimination against Asian Americans. They still shape the public narrative in really, really powerful ways. And Kang's attention to that is a reflection of the fact that this is the narrative of Asian America that has dominated the headlines. What is less seen in that kind of news coverage is that in all of these cases, Asian Americans have also been, defending race-conscious admissions have been playing a strong role. Asian Americans play a really strong role in the Thomas Jefferson, and I won't get into it because I know it's not familiar to everyone, but in K through 12 efforts to integrate magnet schools, Asian Americans have also been working to support those reforms, but it doesn't align with the public narrative as well. And I will say it's not as grassroots as, and I think Kong makes this point, as these anti-equity movements in the Asian American community. I just saw some data though from the Virginia elections, and in Asian American, the size of the Asian American population, Kong is wrong about this. In Virginia, the size of the Asian American population in a district was actually correlated with more support for the Democrat Terry McAuliffe between the last election and this one. And so again, it's this narrative that Asian Americans are racially conservative, and some certainly are, but as a whole, it's a more complicated story.
I'm going to try to combine two questions that have been sent to me. One is about, they kind of get hyper-local. One is about, have there been good measures of anti-Asian or anti-Black hate on our campus? Or if there have not been, how could there be good measures of that hate? And then also thinking about the ways your courses are so cross-disciplinary and listed in a lot of areas. You must encounter students from a wide variety of parts of campus, and you observe that kind of approach in different populations.
So measuring anti-Asian sentiment and anti-Black sentiment is it can be done, but it also on our campus, I think it is done through self-reporting for the most part, and sometimes that can lead to not every community feels comfortable self-reporting. So we do have like a student and staff faculty, I wouldn't call it a hotline, but it's a reporting center, right, for these kinds of incidents. And we measure it in our surveys as both experience with discrimination, but I think it's also critical. The thing that has been driving and changing over the past years is really thinking about racial resentment from especially racially conservative whites who are now Republican, whites who identify as Republican are actually reporting higher levels of anti-white discrimination than anti-Black. They're saying that there's more anti-white discrimination than anti-Black discrimination. And so we're at this other kind of crossroads in our public opinion. In the classroom, these are, this is what I love about the classroom, is this is not a one-off discussion about race and race relations. The classroom really allows you to have a sustained conversation about race and racism in a way that almost no other context allows you to have, especially with people who don't necessarily share your views. And so it has been a really rich experience to have these conversations in the classroom over 15 weeks.
Thank you so much. Does anybody else have any questions or comments they'd like to offer up? Seeing none, I really want to thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us this morning. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure all of us did. So maybe with a little virtual round of applause for Janelle.
Thank you so much. It was great to be in conversation with you.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everybody.
Thanks.